It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Net migration to the UK is estimated to have halved. Whose party's policies are responsible for that fall? A signing ceremony to the handover of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius has been delayed after a High Court injunction.
It's not possible to reduce the prison population without either stopping some people going to prison or reducing the time that people spend in prison.
Can the public be persuaded that sometimes prison doesn't work?
It definitely would help.
Yeah.
Definitely help.
So many people, they need it.
But after the U-turn, how many more pensioners will get winter fuel payments and when? Joining us today, Labour peer Aisha Hazarika, Conservative MP, former Foreign and Home Secretary James Cleverly, The Guardian's political editor Pippa Crerar and former Conservative advisor Git O'Harry. This is Politics Live. Hello and welcome. Well, let's start with this headline in BBC News. You heard it at the beginning of the programme. UK net migration fell to 431,000 in 2024, almost half the 2023 total. Estimates from the Office for National Statistics. Yes, they are the latest estimates. They show that net migration, that's the number of people coming into the country minus the number of people leaving, fell by that figure that you have just heard, almost 50% of the total in 2023. Now, the ONS says the main reason for the fall is the number of study dependents, that's family members, and so on foreign students coming here was down by 86%. My opening question to the panel, starting with you, Aisha, is who can take credit for net migration falling?
Well, it's one of those things, success has many fathers, isn't it? Everybody's claiming credit for this. And it is welcome that the numbers have come down. And yes, the previous government did put in measures that got some of these numbers down, but the previous government was also in power when the numbers absolutely rocketed as well. And we remember the days when David Cameron said he wanted to reduce immigration to the tens of thousands, and it rocketed to nearly a million. So look, it is welcome that these figures have come down. But, you know, we've still got work to do in this, but also the conversation that we have around immigration. You know, I do feel it's still, we're not having the right conversations about immigration. Yes, I do think the numbers are too high, but we also have to be realistic. We do need some immigration. Immigration is positive for this country, particularly in areas like health and social care. I know we want to train people up. Yeah. That will take time.
But what did you make then of Keir Starmer saying we're at risk of becoming an island of strangers?
Well, he did also say in his speech that he, you know, celebrated a diverse country. But I know that sort of that language caused a lot of anger, and I understand that. But the white paper has got some important policy issues in it as well. So I think on the whole, it's good that these numbers are coming down. Remember, this is legal migration. The issue of the small boats is also very important as well. And I think in terms of winning back confidence of people in mainstream politics, immigration is something that both parties and all serious parties have got to deal with. With a common sense lens, but a compassionate lens as well.
James, who can take credit for net migration falling as a former Home and Foreign Secretary?
I think Rishi Sunak can take. Obviously, the easy answer is to say me, but there's but there's more to it than that. Look, when Rishi asked me to move from Foreign Secretary to Home Secretary, his brief to me, we had breakfast together, just the two of us, and he said that we have to get a grip on immigration, and he said, you have got to make sure we get a grip on immigration. And so with his full backing, I set about working with the Treasury, with the Department of Education, with DEFRA, all these government departments who have a real interest in migration figures, to basically come up with a package that we could work, that we could sell cross-government. So I brought in the changes of the minimum income threshold. I brought in the changes to student visa dependence on student visas, because universities should be providing education, not a backdoor for immigration. And what we're now seeing is, because of those changes that I put in place with Rishi's full backing and support, we've now got net migration down by half. Still work to do.
I mean, it did reach its height, of course, as Aisha was saying, of nearly 1 million coming down from that. You're not the only one who, it may be the easy answer, but it may also be correct to take credit. Robert Jenrick has said, when I was the immigration minister, I fought relentlessly for the biggest changes to our legal migration system in history. That's going to bring down the number of people coming into our country by 300,000. Does he deserve the credit?
Well, look, Robert did a lot of work when he was immigration minister, but ultimately the big difference was getting the sign-off across other government departments. That happened whilst I was Home Secretary. Tom Pursglove, who was my immigration minister at the time, did a huge amount of work as well. So, of course, Rob did work hard, but ultimately it was the changes that I put in place.
Who can take credit for this?
Well, unfortunately for James and Robert Jenrick and probably a series of other Home Secretaries and immigration ministers over many years, the public won't be paying any attention at all to who's responsible. What they will see is that there's a Labour government in power and that figures have fallen dramatically. It is definitely the case that changes that were brought in under James made an impact, a dramatic impact. Most of those changes, bar one I think it is, you were saying earlier, have been continued by this government. So they will also probably be putting their hands up and saying it's down to us too. And what I think is really interesting is how migration, which has always been one of the sort of the big top 3 or 4 issues amongst voters, has in the last couple of weeks really sort of shot up the agenda. Cost of living is still the top, obviously. But we saw Keir Starmer's immigration plans the other week. His sort of pitching to the right, which makes many in his own party feel very uncomfortable, to me seems there's a direct line between the rise of Nigel Farage and reform and this number 10's response to that. And I think that
and the language that they've used too.
There's sort of the echoes of Enoch Powell's speeches and so on. And I think the issue that they will have is that while it is absolutely the case that the Labour 2024 vote, a chunk, maybe 7% of those people are reform inclined, say they'd back reform now. There's a bigger chunk, double that at least, on the sort of the progressive wing, if you want to call it that, of the party, who are tempted by parties like the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, the Scottish Nationalists and Plaid. And those voters are very uncomfortable with some of that rhetoric. So it's about making sure that while you have the action, the numbers coming down, the rhetoric matches that.
It is a big number in terms of the fall, Gitto. Will the remainder, the 430,000 net migration figure, still feel a big number to people?
It will for some, but I'm sort of really anxious about the sort of fetish with the numbers, if you like, and credit to James when he did put these measures in. He did not lace it with this language that panders to Nigel Farage and reform. He laced it with, we need to control our borders in a sensible way, not this sort of nasty little edge of racism that has crept into Keir Starmer's. So if we carry on with this kind of obsession that people who come here from abroad are a bad thing, not recognising that people who come here from abroad or their parents and they end up as foreign secretary or wherever, or they're doctors and they're engineers and all that, it's very, very dangerous.
And is that in response partly because your former boss, Boris Johnson, was actually pro-immigration, really broadly speaking, and the numbers did go up at odds with many within the Conservative Party?
Yeah, and some of them hadn't quite clocked what the record showed in terms of Boris's view that, we benefit from the best people from different parts of the world beyond the European Union being able to come here, not just defaulting to migrants from within the European Union. Was
it a deliberate policy then of his?
I think his instincts are that, he himself, and he's talked about it a lot, is a bit of a, crossbreed, if you like, from different cultures and traditions and parts of the world. And it's something that he was very fond of. But I think there was also 2 big blocks of people who came from Hong Kong. He's very clear that we owed them an obligation. And Ukraine, that was another big block. Right. And again, there's not many people out there who thought that was the wrong decision to take.
Right.
That economic link that Aisha talked about, though, and that Gitto also talked about the benefits of migration too. Something else which this government has done Keir Starmer explicitly has said that he's delinking it, if you like. He says we can't think about migration necessarily being an economic benefit, and they want to they're putting some pressure on the Office of Budget Responsibility to look again at how it costs migration, if you like, to take more into account about how, as people grow older and rely more on services, which is quite a move away from all the language that we've heard about it being an economic benefit.
You have to look at a number of things. You have to look at the economic benefits, and by the way, we have a declining birth rate in this country as well. You know, there's some people might want to try and decouple it from the economy. It's very difficult.
The growth could have been even lower without those levels of immigration, as you're saying.
Absolutely, and I think that we have to have a serious conversation about, you know, people coming in and paying their taxes and you know, picking up the slack with those services. But there is also a really important conversation to be had about skills, and you know, you hear the sort of, you know, providing training for our own. That's very admirable. That costs a lot of money and resources. But you do have to look at cultural issues as well, like things like community cohesion. All of that is incredibly important. I grew up as an immigrant family. We did so much integration. I did my Quran lessons on a Saturday morning and then went to learn country dancing lessons in Scotland.
Varied.
So, but all of that costs money. You have to put money into kind of English classes for sort of people. You know, social cohesion just doesn't happen by accident. But this language around, I think if we could try and frame our immigration in a way which was pragmatic, but not always kind of pandering to Nigel Farage, that would be helpful as well.
James?
Well, one of the things that I think was a game changer in bringing the changes through is one of the conversations that I had with Jeremy Hunt when he was Chancellor. And we discussed the importance of looking at GDP per capita. So Treasury has traditionally looked at GDP as a general term. GDP per capita gives you a much better indication about whether people are feeling better off. And I think one of the reasons why the immigration debate became so heated was because Treasury and Treasury officials, the ONS, were saying, oh, we're all getting richer, meaning GDP was increasing. But there are loads of people in the country saying, I'm not feeling it. And so therefore, I think you're lying to me. So I do think we have to have a more balanced conversation. But the simple truth is that we should not, no country should just rely on large-scale importation of low-skilled labour. No country should have border control that is out of the control of government and is being controlled by criminal gangs. This was a step in the right direction. I'm massively disappointed that the Labour Party, who criticised me at the time, are now going to claim credit for these figures. And in the areas they should have done more, small boats, they're actually doing less.
Right. You'd have probably done the same, though, if it had been the other way around and you were in power now for those figures. That's how it falls, I suppose, in
But
politics.
also, Rishi Sunak said he was going to stop the boats.
Well, and you say you're going to smash the gangs.
Well,
not you, but the government is going to.
Says,
let's have a look at this. It came out overnight, the Daily Telegraph story. Starmer to hand Mauritius billions in Chagos deal. Prime Minister will attend a virtual signing ceremony with representatives from the Mauritian government on Thursday. We've covered this story quite a lot. But then, this morning, this is the headline in the BBC. Chagos deal paused by last-minute legal action. Yes, it is being held up. The figures are still being bandied about of £9 billion of the cost of signing away the Chagos Islands. The government disputes that figure, but as I say, it's been paused. James, you started negotiations with Mauritius over the Chagos Islands. Do you want to take credit for that?
Well, no, because I didn't sign off the deal. And
Where were you with the deal?
So, look, there's because of the nature of the military facilities on Diego Garcia, there's stuff that should not be in the public domain, and I'm not going to go beyond what is appropriate for me to discuss. But it goes to a broader point about the Labour Party or the Labour government's inability to negotiate. And we've seen this now with the EU. It's clear that they think the point of negotiation is to get to a deal, any deal under any circumstances. I've always said, and I said this during the Brexit negotiations, if you can't get a deal that works, don't do the deal. I did not, and David Cameron, when he stepped in as Foreign Secretary after me, he did not sign off a deal with Mauritius because we weren't comfortable with what the Mauritians were asking for. And if you can't do a good deal, don't do the deal at all. And I worry, particularly when we look at those kind of figures being bandied around, we still don't know what protections are in place about the critical facilities that are on those islands.
Although Donald Trump seems to think it's OK.
Well, his interests and our interests are aligned, but they are not the same. And it should not be the case that the British Foreign Office or the British Foreign Secretary or the British Prime Minister delegates UK foreign policy to someone else's president.
Well,
the bottom line was we did not get a deal we were happy with. I didn't sign off this deal. And until we know the details of what was agreed with Mauritius,
do you think
I
it should
it's
stay in
very
UK?
suspicious.
And you think it should stay in UK hands?
So UK sovereignty over the Chagos Islands was and is absolutely key.
Aisha?
Well, look, we know that there's been a sort of legal intervention, and I know this is a very contentious issue, and even there's even people within the Labour Party who want to see more details. I mean, what's difficult about this is there's a lot of stuff we don't know about this because of the security nature of this. But, you know, James was involved in the early negotiations. I do think that, to be honest, it's hard to claim you'd never do a bad deal because the last Brexit deal was really, really poor. So I think the EU kind of thing is not a good comparison, and saying kind of no deal is better than a bad deal. Well, we've all had to
the
live
deal's just got
with
worse.
a really...
I mean...
It hasn't got worse. It's going to make... It was a bad deal. Now this new deal is going to try and make life a bit easier for businesses, for tourists. Surely that is a good thing for the country.
But not for fishermen.
But in terms of... Well, there's one set of fishermen that are not happy, but you do have to look at the economy in the right.
But on the Chagos...
On this, look, we don't know all the details of this because we're not privy to it, but... You know, it is interesting that beforehand the attack from the Conservatives was Trump will never sign off on this, you're never going to get this through. And then Trump said, actually, this is a good thing. And that does mean that, you know, we have got some alignment with our security and defence concerns.
But does £9 billion sound like an awful lot of money to you? Yes, it would be spread over many years, although front-loaded, to use that.
But then to come back on that, you know, you could pose that question about big defence. You know, this is a strategically important defence manoeuvre. You could come back on any defence spending and say, does that sound like that's, you know, a lot of money to you? The answer is probably yes, but we need it for defence.
Pippa, I mean, do you know any of the detail behind this? Because it's true, and we've discussed it in the past, there have been blazing rows on Politics Live in the studio, and then you find out that actually no one is really quite sure what's actually been negotiated, except, of course, on this occasion, James will know some of the detail because he was involved at the time. Yeah. Do you think it's a fair claim to say that Labour is not very good at negotiating these sorts of deals?
Well, I mean, there was obviously, as you've all said, a deal that they inherited and built on. I think the cost has been a big problem for them because even though it's spread over so many years, it is reported to be about £90 million a year. And certainly in the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of concern inside Downing Street about how easy it is to sell the national security aspect of it aside, how easy it is to sell the financial commitment to the ongoing lease when you're making cuts to benefits, when you're, well, they've now U-turned on winter fuel, but, you know, when there's sort of all sorts of other areas which are facing cuts, which many Labour MPs are very angry about, which came up on the doorstep all the time in the local elections. So I think the cost bit of it, they were hoping, there was a wobble last week, I think, about, you know, this going forward. And now this High Court judge blocking it means that it will continue on. You know, we're not at a resolution yet. They can't just park it and move on.
Why is it such a totemic issue, this, the Chagos Islands? Because for many people, of course, with the national security, it's incredibly important. But for many people, what you would think, what is it that's so important about it?
I think it's just very, very sneaky. It wasn't presented ahead of the election. Nobody voted for it. I don't remember there being a proposal in Parliament and a proper parliamentary debate. It was presented as a fait accompli, stitched up by lawyers, essentially, who were very close to Keir Starmer. Some people think there are conflicts of interest behind this, and, you know, no doubt the press will have a closer look at that now that other lawyers or the courts have decided this is not clean. There's something about it that doesn't smell right. And also then you just focus on the big issue of sovereignty and the financial cost, and you've got a cocktail of things that just looks like, you know, bad politics.
It does get to the heart, really, as well, of Britain's role in the world. And I think there's a feeling, particularly on some on the right, about that Britain's kind of stepped back in that regard, and the threat that some people perceive to be from China and their relationship with Mauritius. It was sort of a bit of sovereign territory slap bang in the middle of the Indian Ocean in a really geopolitically sensitive part of the world. Why are we stepping back from that is the question, and it kind of goes, I think, to some quite fundamental issues of what is Britain's broader role in the sort of the geopolitical security map.
Well, let's go to a fundamental issue here, and this headline in The Independent: violent criminals could be released from prison early under new plan. The independent sentencing review, which was carried out by former Conservative Lord Chancellor David Gauke, it's finished, and recommended that violent prisoners, including those convicted of sex offences and domestic abuse, some of them could be released after serving just a third of their sentence in a bid to ease prison overcrowding. And to give you and remind you of the context of overcrowding, figures in April showed that fewer than 1,000 spare prison cells were available across England and Wales, only 961 to be precise, and prisons were 98.9% full. But Gito, can the government persuade the public that sometimes prison just doesn't work?
You can on some things. You can certainly say that it's a waste of precious resource to lock up people who are not a threat to other people in society as a form of punishment. And I think that first and foremost, prison is a place to take people who are a threat to you, particularly physically, out of circulation. So the hardest sell of the lot is to say that people who are there because they are violent and no previous deterrent has worked are suddenly going to be back on the streets. That's hard for the victim to swallow. That's hard for the rest of us to swallow. And if the motive for that is not that they've had a massive come to Jesus conversion or whatever in prison and they've seen the error of their ways, at which point I think there should be sort of risk and reward assessment. But this is because the government needs to save money. And that is not a good incentive. To save money, we're going to have our streets, crawling with dangerous criminals. And the shots of the people they released before, coming out, celebrating with champagne outside the prison wall, really quite sickening, no matter how liberal or illiberal you are.
Aisha?
Well, look, this is a huge problem, and to be fair to the government, they inherited a real mess on this. And, Alex Chalk, the former Justice Secretary, has been incredibly honest about the inheritance that was left to the Labour Party. And the fact that we have practically run out of prison cells on the male estate is an absolute disaster. And it is important to say that the prison population really grew over the last 10 to 14 years. The number of net prison places that were built were 500. Now, you can't build your way out of this problem.
But can you sell this? Can you sell this to the voting public?
You have to try and have a kind of nuanced, honest conversation with people. And certainly there are some people that shouldn't be in prison, and perhaps there are other ways, community services and all of that. There are others who, in my view, particularly from a victim's point of view, anything to do with sexual violence, domestic abuse, and I know some of the victims' commissioners are worried about this. You have to, give confidence to victims of crime, particularly, in my view, women. I think that's really important. But what I would say is, look, I'm sympathetic to the government trying to change the script on this, because clearly just locking people up and this revolving cycle. I was in Brixton Prison a couple of years ago. You go in there, you're speaking to some young lads. This is their third, fourth time in prison. You're like, something is going wrong. But if you're going to release people early, this is what you also need. You need them to have housing. You need them to have a job. You often need help with addiction services, mental health issues. They need some, kind of mentor. The probation service is stretched.
That sounds like a lot of resource
exactly.
and time.
All of that does cost money. And I think as a society, we've got to try and change the conversation, and we've got to change the outcomes about people just being in this revolving door of offending.
Well,
but this does cost money.
James, how do you think the government could or should sell the idea of releasing prisoners, some of them who have been imprisoned for pretty dangerous, as the public would see it, offences, and leaving their sentences early?
Well, I don't think those are the people that should be released early.
When I
was working with Gito at City Hall with Boris Johnson as mayor, I was involved with Kit Malthouse and others on a project at Feltham Young Offenders Institution to try and prevent young men getting on this kind of cycle of criminality. And it was about, in large part, not exclusively, in large part, it was about making sure they had jobs to go to post-incarceration. A number of employers worked with us on that. And we should look to make sure that prison is for people that we're scared of rather than people that we're angry with. And we should not be having violent, particularly people who have been sent down for sexual violent crimes. What we should look to do is make sure we prevent people getting on that conveyor belt to crime. So on that regard, I agree with David Gauke. We should look at that. But The simple fact of the matter is we're under pressure for prison places because during COVID, many other countries let prisoners out and we chose not to. So we are now having to deal with some of the pressures as a result.
You could have
of a
built,
conscious
I
decision.
suppose, more prisons during that time.
There was such a problem with building, and even in your own constituency, there was a lot of NIMBYism around building prisons. Even in your own constituency, people did not want to have a prison.
Yeah, well, look, if you've been to the site that was proposed, you will see it is in the middle of nowhere. It is nowhere near any rehabilitation facilities. There are 2 prisons next door, one in Haverhill, one in Chelmsford, both of whom are struggling to recruit enough prison officers. In my constituency, we have very, very low unemployment, so I don't know who you think might work in that prison if it were to be built between 2 prisons that are currently struggling to get prison officers.
Sure, they're the excuses, but the point is the prison didn't get built, and there's so many other areas where the prisons were, there's loads of Conservative MPs who are like, no, not on my patch. Look, it is difficult to build prisons. I understand that, and you have to have the infrastructure. But someone has got to bite the bullet and actually... Now, you can't build your way out of this problem, but you do need to build more prisons.
But can you philosophically change people's mind over the conversation that Aisha was talking about in terms of some prisoners being released that you wouldn't want to?
Well, look, the question answers itself. Should we be releasing prisoners that we don't want to be releasing? And the obvious answer is no.
Well, the public wouldn't want you to release them.
And the public, we are the servants of the public. And if people are saying, I don't want sexual predators being let out of prison early, then I think a sensible government should listen to those concerns. There are people in the prison estate who we should focus on making sure don't go back to prison, reducing the reoffending rate. But the bottom line is people who are a threat to the public should not be. But
I think we just got to be really clear. Look, I don't want to just totally relitigate what happened to the last government, but on the criminal...
Kemi Begnaud said stop whining about the last government in Prime Minister's question.
Yeah, all right. On the criminal justice system, I'm afraid, you look at the police getting hollowed out. You look at the backlog.
Numbers went up.
Oh, James, they went down and then they went up. You speak to any police officer about the loss of experience.
So Essex has more police officers now than at any... Well, when I was Home Secretary, than at any point in its history.
Police went down under the... part of austerity went down. The backlogs in the criminal justice system, the courts, we got to the stage where rape was practically decriminalised as an
I'm sorry,
offence.
you've got to stop.
No,
that is
absolutely
that is not
case.
true.
You speak to
Aisha,
victims groups, you speak to women's charities.
Well,
only 500 prison places got built. So I'm afraid on criminal justice, the last Conservative government... And the Conservative...
But the reality, though, Aisha... Well, James, first of all, how much money... All right, let you answer on the decriminalisation of rape.
I'm going to pull up... Because I know that is something... That is a phrase, and it's very emotive, and it's very headline-grabbing.
But is it also true?
No, it's not true.
It is.
It's not. It's
rape,
not.
The conviction rates for rape went
Conviction numbers went up.
Conviction rates
the conviction rate went down because more people were coming forward. So more people were being convicted, but the fact that women were doing what we asked them to do, which is come forward in greater... let me finish.
I do a lot of work with women's charities and women's...
Let him finish and then I'll come back to you.
This is really important.
All right, well, finish your point.
Conviction numbers went up. Because we said we wanted more women to come forward, more women did come forward. Oh, come on. Let me finish the point.
Well, you have to get to the end of your point.
Conviction rates went down because more women were coming forward. The number of people incarcerated went up. And this was something I worked on very hard when I was Home Secretary, following on from the work of others. But when you say things like rape has been largely decriminalised, it disincentivises women coming forward, which is the opposite of what we want.
James,
language really matters on this.
It does really matter, and that is the language. That is the language that victims themselves say, James. That is the language that women's charities, and these are people who are battling the system, the system. When you look at the combination of police numbers going down, when you look at the absolutely appalling levels of conviction for rape and other sexual offences as well, you look at the backlog in the criminal justice system. I'm sorry, that does not add up to a rosy picture on law and order.
Very, very briefly. No, hang on. No, he didn't say it was,
that
but
is not what I'm saying. The point is,
James and Aisha...
You're suggesting, and I know you don't mean it to sound like this, but that choice of words what victims may well hear is, what is the point in me reporting this crime?
Well, I think they did.
If I've just
James,
heard...
I do enough work with victims that I know
You've
exactly
had this discussion.
how
I just want to ask briefly,
I met
importantly,
with victims
in order...
victims groups, and as I say, I know you don't mean it to do this, but that language disincentivises women from coming forward.
Women are disincentivised for coming forward
and we
for a
shouldn't
number of reasons.
we shouldn't amplify that.
But I think you just have to be... what I would
that.
not do if I were you is try and wave the bunting for what a brilliant job was done.
Well,
I don't think... Hang on.
Start of this discussion.
That.
Start of this discussion is that this government is going to release some of those people early. So that takes it to another level. So arguing over the spilt milk of the past, and it's pretty clear the difference between...
Can I just say rape conviction? I wouldn't say spilt milk as
No,
a great kind of
about
analogy.
which decisions were taken by government, the difference between total numbers and rate, which seems pretty clear to me. But at the moment, your government is proposing to release some of these rapists early. That is something we should focus a lot more over than who did what in the past.
But it also would, just to be fair, it would also be worth pointing out that the last government also had occasions where it had to release prisoners, sometimes quite dangerous prisoners. And to me, what this all shows is that the system has not been fit for purpose. And it is not just about how you get people to avoid going into cycles of violence in the first place and ending up in prison and going back in afterwards. It's also about the court system, and we're going to hear some more from the government, I think, with the Levinson review in the next few weeks on, for example, I think 17,000 people are currently locked up in prison because they're on remand waiting to go to trial. You know, you speed up the court system, you improve the court system, you can get some of people out that way. I think everyone would be more comfortable with that than letting out serious, dangerous offenders. Also, you have the points about probation when they come out. And I think one thing we'd all agree on is that the probation service just doesn't have enough money.
Well,
and if they're being asked to
that
do
was what I was
extra
trying to ask
now,
both
how's it
Aisha
going
and
to
James,
work?
is that neither party is prepared or has been prepared to sort of dedicate the amounts of money. We haven't got time to go further on it. The amounts of money that would be needed to do all of the things that you have outlined in terms of probation and building.
James Timpson is a real expert on this. He is the prisons minister
Yeah.
in the Lords, and he is somebody who I think cross-party, you'd agree, he has got a lot of knowledge of this.
We're going to return to the drama of yesterday at Prime Minister's Questions, because the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, actually made news by announcing a U-turn on that winter fuel payment story to pensioners. This is The Guardian. Starmer announces U-turn over winter fuel after fierce backlash. How did it come about, Pippa?
Well,
how long have we got?
A couple of weeks ago, I was speaking, or had been over a long period of time, speaking to people inside Downing Street across government who told me that they recognised that Rachel Reeves' decision to cut winter fuel payment to all but the poorest pensioners, one of the first acts of government after their big election victory, was a disaster, and not just electorally, but the fact that so many Labour MPs were really upset about it, and that they needed to try and get them back on side, show them, if you like, that they were listening to them ahead of a big vote on welfare, which we've got coming up next month. And so they said that inside Downing Street, they were now talking about actually U-turning on this. You'll remember the very next day, there was very hard denials from Downing Street that they were considering changing the policy. Specifically, we talked about tweaking the threshold, the £11,500 threshold over which the winter fuel payment is no longer received. They absolutely denied it. No change now, no change at all. Fast forward 2 weeks and Keir Starmer announces a U-turn.
Well, they bounced into it.
Well, they say that the economic circumstances had changed to such an extent that they now had the freedom to be able to say that come the autumn, they would make the change then. However, I think it is undeniable that there were political forces at play, both on their backbenches, and MPs were spooked. Labour activists were spooked going out on the doorstep during the local elections. Winter fuel was the number one issue which people complained about.
How many more pensioners do we think we're talking about?
Well, this is the problem. We neither know how many of the 10 million pensioners that had it taken off them will get it back. Presumably they got that up the threshold a bit to try and mitigate for some of that bit in the middle. We also don't know exactly when it will come in. The indication is it'll be announced in the October budget. If that's at the end of the October, as it was last year, that probably won't be in time for when the payments start to go out in November.
Do you think the government should have thought about the policy post the U-turn, before the U-turn, when they were bouncing into it?
Well, I hope they would have done. Look, first of all, I'm glad that the government has U-turned.
So it's the
on
right
this.
thing to do.
It was the right thing to do.
And to be fair to Aisha, she said after the story 2 weeks ago, she said, probably getting told off by Downing Street in the process, I don't know, certainly not pleasing her colleagues, she said they should U-turn.
Should they U-turn completely? Should they just reverse it?
Look, I mean, I'm not in the DWP and the Treasury to know the figures. I think what they need to do, I think, first of all, I think it was a mistake, the policy. I think the mistake was a policy. I think the policy was a mistake. I think it is good that they've listened. I think they have to listen to voters. Pippa is absolutely correct. The length and breadth of the country, this winter fuel allowance has come up as a really, really big issue, and it has done political damage, particularly there's big elections coming up next year, Scotland, Wales. But now that they have listened, I think it's good to be a listening government. I think sometimes you can say, we didn't get this right and we have to listen. But if I were them, and, you know, I'm not in the Treasury, I don't know the figures, I would get on with it sooner rather than later, and I would do it quickly.
Is it good to listen? I suppose it is, or does it look weak?
But essentially, they've listened to anxious backbenchers who've got hysterical over one particular policy. And after the hottest week of the year, when everybody's turning their heating off, they suddenly announce this random thing without the detail. That shows political panic, not anything else. In principle, when 1 in 4 pensioners is, at least on paper, a millionaire, the idea of means testing that payment makes sense. It's a no-brainer. And we need more money for prison places. We need more money for lots of things. So you have to actually take some tough decisions. They maybe got the threshold wrong. They can tweak that. But this is designed to do something else. And the problem now is you have paid the ransom. And when you pay a ransom, the kidnappers think, I'll come back and I'll take somebody else hostage. And so already backbenchers are talking about some of the welfare changes. They're talking about child benefit. And if you actually cave in on each one of those, you end up with a massive deficit, with taxes going up, and a Labour government yet again leaving office with, you know, unemployment higher than what they inherited and the public finances in a worse situation than what they inherited.
Right, isn't that the risk? They'll come back for more.
Same old, same old.
The pay review bodies are going to come out today with pay increases. People will be thinking this is a government for turning.
Well, first of all, as fond as I am of Guto, I don't think we'll take lectures from the Conservatives about what. Let's see what the Labour government leaves when it leaves, and then let's compare, you know, the state of the country with the Tories. But to move on from that, look, this has been really difficult. I'm not going to lie. It's not been easy, and as you say, it's very difficult financially. But I think when you look at this in the aggregate, it was not a huge amount of money for the amount of damage it was.
Well, that was the question as to why they did it in the first place. But
so this is the really key point with this. So, if the Labour Party had come into government and basically said, look, this is structurally unfair, this does this, this does the other, we've thought about this, and actually we want to rebalance the burden between. I would understand. They didn't. They said, we don't want to do this. We have to do this. We don't have a choice. Well, guess what? After they get punished at the ballot box and their backbenchers panic, suddenly it turns out they do have a choice and they're not forced to do it. And it wasn't something that they got painted into a corner. It was a conscious choice. And worse than that, it was the first thing they did.
Right,
when
well,
they
it was within weeks. But James,
the point being is, what we now know is their excuse for this and a whole load of other things is nonsense. Politics, and particularly government, is about choices. They chose what they thought was going to be an easy headline, and it makes a complete lie of the fact that they were forced to do these things because. But
I said so yesterday. I was curious. Why didn't Kemi Bade not notice that Keir Starmer made this massive announcement and U-turn yesterday at Prime Minister's questions?
She wanted to make sure that he, in front of the cameras, at the dispatch box, in front of parliamentarians, said out loud, I am U-turning on this policy.
But he had. He said it. He said it pretty well at the beginning. She missed it.
No, she wanted to make sure he said it again.
Really?
And look, if I was her, I'd want to make sure he says it every Wednesday, every single time, because this goes to the heart of the dishonesty that underpins Labour's positions on a whole load of things.
So it was a tactic. It was a tactic by Kemi Bade not to pick up on it.
They said that they had to do this because of their economic inheritance. We now know that that is a nonsense. So it's absolutely right for Kemi to make him say it. Every time he says it, it's bad news for them, it's good news for us, so he can't say it often enough.
Politics is about choices, right? But you could equally say George Osborne had a choice when he came in over austerity rather than pinning it all on the global crash, which he subsequently announced. He blamed on Gordon Brown and ended up being, he admitted, was about the global crash. I mean, look, that's what incoming governments do. They blame stuff on their predecessors. I think what, for me, it is absolutely clear that it's a political choice, a bad one. Cabinet ministers across the board, people inside Downing Street say it was a mistake. I think the hope internally is that they've learned from that and they'll be a bit more careful about what decisions they actually make. Their new government learning. Yeah. I know that it's neither of your interest to sort of cut them some slack on that. We obviously want to hold them to account, but they have listened, and all the polling, I suspect their internal polling shows the same as the external, shows that the public does not regard these big U-turns, despite what journalists say about them, as a sign of weakness.
I want to ask,
move on to the next thing.
Their MPs will move on to the next thing, and there'll be another crunch issue, and people will panic. But actually, I'm afraid, Jo, there's something far more important than even all of this, because this is Jo's last programme.
Oh,
and some people want to actually say a special sort of goodbye to you. So forgive this break.
It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. This is Politics Live, but the politics won't stop. Why should the common people listen to you, Jarvis?
Oh, they don't have to listen to me. I mean, I just turned up and spoke.
I think that's a slur on 17.4 million people.
It's not.
And I think you should apologise on national television.
And the big topic today, well, you've guessed it, it's top-up fees.
This new harmonious era.
We've only just begun.
Remember this?
What's that I hear? Oh, angled. Right, more angle.
Yes, and this?
And get in.
Oh, my God.
Get yourself in.
I'm in.
You've got to get physical,
Is it? Right, we've got to look into that camera.
You look that way.
Oh, sorry, yes, I'm so used to looking to the camera. Oh, head back. Right, how do we look?
Much improved.
Marvellous.
And then when Jo Coburn, the presenter, challenged him, and she had to challenge him 3 times, she said, where will you get the money?
And actually, the UK is better off in our growth numbers than France, Germany, Italy, USA, Canada, Japan.
Right.
Do you want me to continue?
We're going to show, just before we let you go, this graph, which actually stands in stark contrast to what you've just said.
You seem to be a little exercised, sir.
Well, because I'm offended.
Her whole pitch to the Tory party was, I'm going to be a swashbuckling tax cutter.
I'm going to interrupt because he's out. He's been sacked. So Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor, and he can only have been in with Liz Truss for a matter of 10, 15 minutes, if we understood the timing correctly. He's gone. I can name all the companies, the recruitment companies, Hayes, Manpower, Randstad. They've signed the letter saying this is the wrong approach. You're going to put jobs at risk. Which are the companies that have welcomed your employment rights?
Well, like I say, I've spoke to many companies. We've had many roundtables with them.
Hang on. Grace, there is a point that Dominic Raab said that there will be a day of reckoning if Brexit doesn't happen. And there would be a day of reckoning, the implication is, if it went to a second referendum. The headline says, bonk for Britain. Women should get tax cuts for having children to encourage a baby boom, Cabinet Minister suggests. Luke?
As a gay man, bonking for Britain won't make much of a difference to the birth rate for me.
What do you say to consumers who literally can't afford to pay even for some of the basics if they've gone up the way that cheese sandwich has with all its ingredients?
Well, then you don't do the cheese sandwich.
That's it. I'm going to let them shout while I just say goodbye. I'll be back at 11:15 tomorrow. They're talking still. Bye. Well, now I know what everyone's been doing in the office over the past few weeks. Why I couldn't find anybody to help me with today's programme. Thank you so much for keeping that secret. Very professionally done, I have to say, Gita. I did wonder what you were going to do at that particular point. And thank you for behaving, just about, the 4 of you, because as you've seen from that film, there were still many occasions where people almost didn't quite behave. Anyway, it is a final farewell from me after today's programme with my esteemed guests in my studio, I suppose I can still call it for the last time, displaying the sort of passion and humour and sometimes expertise on politics, but without a steady stream of all of you journalists, commentators, and people who have to promote books occasionally coming into the studio, there wouldn't be a programme. I've got to thank all of the guests who've come on, all of the people who work with me here, all the people I've learnt from over the years. It's been a brilliant experience. I will miss it more than I can say. Gitto, you're looking at me appealingly as if you have something to say.
No, just to say you're now going to be more free for lunches. And we can start the lunches earlier. So
I'm not sure my waistline can actually afford it, but I also have to say thank you to all the viewers, the nearly millions of them. Thanks, Mum, for watching every day loyally. It's been great getting all the emails and messages, not all of them flattering and complimentary, but I'll take the good with the bad, as always. So perhaps for one final time, goodbye, take care, have a very good afternoon. Bye.